Hello and welcome to Perspectives, the podcast series from Luxoft where we discuss the latest technology trends with IT experts and consider their impact on business and consumer lives. My name is Pat Corcoran. I'm the Global Director of Analyst and Advisor Relations at Luxoft, and I will be your host. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Brandon Schulz, Director of Luxoft Retail Practice, with a very interesting IoT twist. Brandon, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
So why don't we start right at the level that everyone likes to start at? What are we hearing and what are we seeing in the retail world? Luxoft was recently at the National NRF event, which is National Retail Foundation's big show, quote unquote, for 2017. Tell me what's going on in the retail world.
It's a good question, Patrick. First of all, the event back in January for NRF was really, really interesting. I think a couple big things were apparent to us in terms of what's happening in retail. The first is the industry itself is growing at such a rapid rate. And by growing, I don't necessarily mean in the amount that consumers are purchasing, because there's obviously the index around that data. But I think the appetite for digital transformation is higher than we've seen in probably the last 5 or 10 years. Digital transformation is kind of making its way into a bunch of different industries and a bunch of different companies. And NRF alone, I think, has seen dramatic increase in attendance, even in the last 2 to 3 years. There's one point at the event, this year where it was almost elbow to elbow, just walking up and down the aisles with people everywhere. So as we look at it, we see that in a lot of ways, kind of all eyes are on retail for what the next big step is, what the next big thing is. That was very, very apparent to us. I think the other thing is, while there's a big appetite, I think there's also, in some ways, a lack of understanding around how to take the first step in the digital transformation journey. And that's something we've been focusing on a lot here at Luxoft to make sure that we can help educate and advise people, but also be able to be practitioners and engineers that can help develop some of these solutions. So NRF was very interesting to see both of those things, right? A lot of traffic in one area, and also on the other side, a lot of technology, a lot of marketing language, a lot of different suppliers, products and solutions out there, but not a lot of clear winners or clear insight into how to move forward towards some of these solutions. So I think that was a big trend we're seeing at the event, and also a big trend we're probably seeing larger in the industry.
Well, I like your point around advising, right? I think this is something that is a very important aspect, particularly of retail, because it's involved from a B2B perspective, from a B2C perspective. There's clearly been a lot of news out there on the impact of technology in the retail world. And I think there's still some disconnect or misunderstanding, or perhaps some hype cycle changes that consumers are not actually understanding that well. So when you talk about advising, if you're going to look at a department store chain, if you're going to look at an online shopping experience, if you're going to look at some sort of, even a street fair, right, where there is a money exchange, a cash exchange, a credit exchange, some type of consumer-based area, how do you break it down? What's happening to their experience? And then on top of that, how are we advising these organizations to deal with what the future is bringing because of the technology?
It's another great question, Patrick. I think you're kind of hinting at this larger gap we have, which is technology and customer experience moving so far out in front of where the retailers are at today. And in that void, understanding how to bridge that gap is just really, really difficult, right? You have people with these beautiful experiences on their phones and using virtual reality and augmented reality and IoT connected systems and things like autonomous vehicles and robotics and artificial intelligence. And all of that stuff is really great. And it's nice to see some progress being made in the larger technology industry in that category. But at the same time, the way in which it can actually affect the retail business is I think, a little bit more difficult. And the pace of change for that technology is faster than the pace of change of the retail companies. So we see that gap not only existent today, but ever increasing over time. So that's something that we try to really help our customers with. And to your advising point, I think one of the things we do our best to do is to help companies understand the way in which they can take the first step. So what does it look like to move towards a robotic strategy in retail? How should they be thinking about not just physical hardware robots, but also software as an all-up bot strategy? And what does it look like to have both the 5-year roadmap and the 6-month near-term value discussion? That's something that's been a big part of us working with these companies. And I think not just being on the strategy side of that, which is obviously something we try to do, but also having experience hands-on with the technology itself, and having engineers in the room that are on staff who've been in the embedded level programming on the robot and who understand some of the complexity around integrating with some of this new technology. I think that is actually really important to the advising part of the conversation, because it's a lot more than just providing advice on how to develop a new business model around a new category that someone should get into. This is actually an entirely new way of operating the business. And there's a whole bunch of other supporting ways that the company should be thinking about some of these things. And it's definitely operating from a technical DNA. And that's something we like to bring to the table. And it's been really successful in the conversations.
Yeah, so that was a great transition, I think, to my next question here. And it's a bit of a curveball, Brandon. I'm sorry, but I think the business outcome piece is certainly growing across all of IT service provider offerings, whether it be in a consulting point of view, all the way down to a technology point of view. And I think, as everyone who's worked in retail, including myself, one of the toughest areas in the technology portion of it, has been, the infamous, we're only making a penny on the dollar from a profit margin point of view. And it doesn't give them a whole lot of budget in some instances to fund non-ERP related areas. So, talk a little bit about, have you seen the discussion with the central IT organization in different retail environments change, because they realize for us to survive as a business, we're going to need the infamous mode 2 work. And that's going to require an investment in order to do that. And so there's certainly connections between revenue, store growth, bottom line, top line. And how are you seeing the transition into, it's either mode 2 or, we're closing doors? How do you see that changing?
Well, first of all, it's different for every retailer. It'll always depend upon how they operate within the larger industry, right? So the difference between a CPG company that doesn't necessarily own the real estate and has to sell their products in through a grocer or other kind of retailer versus the retailer itself that's trying to get things off of shelves and understand stock rates, etc. I think that there's definitely a different way in which they have to think about some of their strategies moving forward. But one of the things that I think is a larger trend that we're seeing in terms of how people are moving through this, there are kind of 3 states that we really talk about. And the first is these companies saying that they want to address a problem. And for the most part, if they address their problem from a technology perspective, they'll say things like, well, we really have to do something with IoT, or we really have to do something with robots or big data. And the strange thing there is they don't actually have an IoT problem or a big data problem. They have some sort of underlying business problem that needs to be solved, but it hasn't surfaced up yet to make it to the conversation. So we categorize this as an unknown problem with an unknown solution. And we work very specifically to take them into the second phase, which is a known problem with an unknown solution. And at that point, we're starting to consider what the size of the prize is to move from one type of mode to another type of mode. And is it a $200 million saving in that category? Or does it increase margin by 2% or whatever that might look like? But that's the first activity that has to happen. If we can then assess what the problem is, we then tackle the unknown solution part of that phase. After that, obviously, you get into the known problem, known solution, where you know exactly what you're trying to solve and how you're going to solve it. Now, the whole point here is most of the companies start in this unknown scenario, and it's always the first movers who can move from the left side all the way to the right side in this third phase. And the first company to get into the known problem, known solution will see the biggest gains. And then everyone else following will say, oh, got it. That's how XYZ company did this. Now I know how it works. I know what the return is, and I can do those things. But at that point, they're then chasing. This is what we see generally in the innovation cycle around how people adopt things. And the companies generally, one of 2 categories there. It's either I want to be the first mover and I want to get to the known problem, known solution before anyone else, or they really just want to wait and see who else has done this first. And after someone else has done it, they're okay with taking a little bit less of the pie in that conversation, but they want to make sure that someone else has proved this out first. And that's been a kind of an interesting way for us to look at how to assess the right way to work with some of the companies we work with.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree that's in the, the IT outsourcing world that there's certainly a morph happening between business units and the central IT organization, because I think at the end of the day, the goal is for the entire business, meaning the company in and of itself, to be successful in whatever it determines to implement, deploy, expand, and obviously in some cases detract a little bit out of their current model to be successful, not only for the consumers but more importantly for the employees themselves. And so it puts Luxoft in an interesting position to sort of help connect the dots internally from an advising point of view to offer some type of best solution moving forward. And so from that side, then I guess talk to me a little bit about how you're seeing implementation being done. Now, is it happening sort of at the big store that sits on Fifth Avenue as a trial, or is it happening at a very local level in, let's say, a small town in South Dakota? I mean, how would you recommend, one, the way to implement a technological change, and two, what are you seeing from adoption from that perspective?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First is, as a part of the process, it's been really interesting to watch companies that are essentially accepting part of what would be considered the development lifecycle and moving that into the real world and the physical space. So some of these companies are actually building out basically training grounds for innovative work. They'll call them innovation labs, or store zero, for example, might be something that they would say. But it's the store or the location where all of this technology needs to land and work first before it makes it anywhere out in the public. For example, even one customer we work with has basically built an imitation of a mall inside of a warehouse. And you walk in and you feel like you're in a mall, and it's really interesting. So I think that's kind of the first place where a lot of these things start, right? You're moving your strategy and the implementation into that space first, in the same way that you would do software in the loop testing or hardware in the loop testing. The very next step in that is having some sort of testing ground to do this, where it feels real and can be iterative and tested over time in a rapid fashion. From there, I think you're totally right in the kind of flagship conversation. Generally, this technology lends itself to the higher spend, higher budget, more focused on customer experience locations, which is going to be these flagships that have high amount of traffic, have easy access to press, and are really going to set forward not just increases in revenue or a decrease in cost, but also going to really speak to the experience for the customer and the brand perception. That's generally the kind of second step, if you will. From there, the third step is to really try and find a representative data sample of the locations that we want to look at. And that can be anything from 3 to 5 stores in a given market to 3 to 20 stores across several markets. It all really just depends on the demographics that they want to try and test, as well as some of the different factors that might impact distribution or various channels around how the company itself operates. But those are all taken into account when we think about doing this kind of new work, because everything should have some sort of kind of scientific testing methodology wrapped around it. You got to have your success metrics ahead of time. Of course, it's not a new concept. It's just very rarely actually done with rigor. But you got to have all of those things in place. And as you start rolling out from an innovation store to a flagship store and then out to your first representative sample, all of those things have to be taken into account, because if you're going to go from there and say, here's the $20 million new initiative we need to do to go from 10 stores to our 1,200 stores here across the U.S., you got to make sure you had your data sample done right. You got to make sure your outcomes were measured properly, and that you can put your full money into what the next step is. That's definitely been a part of the process that we've seen.
All right, so let's take this down, one more notch to the consumer, right? So we had the fortunate pleasure of being quoted by Fund Research in a few of their white papers around 2 areas that certainly we focus on. But I think, the question more broadly is, when one walks into a store and they have this sort of understanding, oh, there's going to be some digital signage here and some omni-channel, changes happening, but I don't know what that means, so. And I'm quoting there, of course, from an independent shopper. Can you talk a little bit about those two areas and the impact you're seeing from a consumer perspective, and a little bit on what you're hearing from the business side of the impact and the metrics and, the sort of results-oriented piece? Well, Brandon, thanks for the bottom line. That's the most important part of all these discussions. I'd like to thank you personally for being here on a very interesting topic.
Thanks for the invitation, Patrick.
So listeners, as you hopefully heard today, the intertwining of technology and business and retail is going to explode if it already hasn't. And we're excited to keep this conversation going and contribute to how you should think about retail in the future.